Today's episode is brought to you by Lamp Rynearson. Lamp Rynearson provides landscape architecture, planning, and civil engineering services. From community-wide master plans to land development, Lamp Rynearson incorporates sustainable design principles and equity in all of our projects. Hello and welcome to the Booked on Planning podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Rouse, transportation planner with the Lincoln Lancaster County Planning Department, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Philip Green, transportation and long-range planner with the Village of Hoffman Estates. We're here to get you hooked on planning through the books that have shaped the field. Let's dive in. Our guest today is Michael Meyer, author of Transportation Planning Handbook. Dr. Meyer has been a professor of transportation engineering at MIT and Georgia Tech, the Director of Transportation Planning and Development for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and a consultant primarily on planning and policy studies. He has written 31 books and chapters and 130 papers or articles primarily on transportation planning. He's received numerous awards from professional organizations and was the 2006 chairman of the Transportation Research Board's Executive Committee. Well, thanks for joining us today, Michael. The Transportation Planning Handbook is now in its fourth iteration, and in the preface, you noted that the update that was done in 2016 morphed into a complete rewrite because so much had changed. Can you talk about how you became involved in writing this book and what represents the biggest changes to the field of transportation planning?
Well, I became involved with writing the handbook because I was very active and am very active in the ITE nationally. I was on several committees and chaired some committees. Also worked with AASHTO, the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, primarily in the policy and planning area. I'm an engineer, but I really focus on planning and policy. And I've worked with the Federal Highway Administration, the Federal Transit Administration. So I've been actively engaged over, I would like to say years, but now it's decades in terms of my field. So I knew the executive director of ITE, and he came to me and said, gee, we want to update the handbook, and would you be willing to do that given all the background I had? And I said yes. I didn't realize it was going to be almost a 2.5-year effort to update it. But yeah, that's how I got involved. And I think the changes in transportation planning, it's a very dynamic field. That particular update really was focusing on changes in technology and social demographic characteristics and some things, new policy tools like freight issues that were not really traditionally part of the transportation planning process. And I think if you look at what's happened in the last 6 years since that edition came out, you have the same issues, technology, whether it's the technology of the transportation system, now connected automated vehicles, electric vehicles, the technology, personal technology, as I call it, of apps. Everyone has apps to figure out where they want to go and what they want to do and how they're going to get there. And certainly there's been a lot of new advances in the technology of planning, the tools, the models, the database, the data analysis tools and synthesis. So all of that is new over the last 6 years, over and above what it was then. But there are also some new policy issues. Certainly climate change resilience, system resiliency is one that's much more important today than it was back 6 years ago or so. Certainly the federal government now is placing more emphasis on it, as are many states, MPOs and cities and towns. And I think that's something that we'll see more of in the next several years. The concept of multimodal transportation has, I think, now manifested itself into very specific approaches like complete streets approaches, which is looking at from perspective of multimodal modes, et cetera. And as well, the emphasis on transportation system management and operations, which for years, planners were interested in capital programs. What are we going to build? Not so much how are we going to operate it, because that was, after all, the purpose of traffic operational people. But I think more and more you're starting to see transportation plans get interested in how do we better operate our system, working with engineers, obviously, and others. But that's another aspect of transportation planning that has not really been one that I think was traditionally part of the curriculum in universities as well as professional responsibilities. I like to say that, and what I tried to do in that edition, is that transportation enables fill in the blank. It enables economic development. It enables environmental quality. Obviously, it enables mobility and accessibility. It, in some sense, enables public health benefits. And what we've been seeing over the last 4 decades that I've been involved is that when I first started, all we were concerned about was transportation. That was our focus. We're done. Now it is not only that, but also what can we do in transportation to help public health? What can we do in transportation to help economic development? What can we do in transportation to help equity, social justice issues? So I think transportation now is a much broader field than it whatever was when I was young, which was a long time ago.
I think that's really nail on the head. And I noticed, I'm a transportation planner now, but that isn't my background. It's relatively a new field to me in the position I'm in now. And I think this book really, frankly, put a lot of fears and anxieties of mine to rest, just reading about that breadth and the overlap with the broader field of planning in and of itself, right? Like some of the new issues are being faced in multiple different strands of planning, like the newer focus on environmental and social justice. That's something... the APA just updated the AICP Code of Ethics to reflect that too, right? We're seeing that. So I wanted to ask a question specifically on process. So I remember a while ago hearing an argument between a younger planner who was like, I really want to just be a transportation planner, and someone else who was saying, well, you need to know everything. Transportation overlays everything, right? You need to know your land use, your economic development. If you were that young planner, that young professional who's really intent on, I want to do transportation planning, where would you begin?
Well, and I think you're going to hear me say this a lot throughout our talk today. It all depends, ... because it really depends on the individual. It depends on his or her background. It depends on the context of the position that they're looking at. Many years ago, when I was a young assistant professor, which is a long time ago, I remember talking to a colleague of mine in Washington, D.C., and next door there was a director of transportation planning for the MPO in Washington, D.C., and I overheard him talking to this other person, and he was talking loud enough so I could hear. He didn't know I could hear. He says, well, all I want is somebody that can crunch the numbers, and this damn Meyer is out there telling people they can actually make a difference. And of course, and that was me that he was referring to, because in my classes, graduate classes at the time, I was trying to broaden the perspective of engineers and planners to say, look, you don't know where you're going to end up in your career, because things come and go, and what you're doing today, now 40 years later, you never would have guessed what was going on. So I guess what I would recommend a new planner is two things. One is, to some extent that person was correct. I mean, most planners need to have some skills of some sort, whether it's in modeling skill, GIS, geographic information systems, data. I mean, you have to be founded or based in some level of methodology, because quite frankly, when you're young and that's what people are looking for. But I would say get involved with the profession, get involved with your local community, get involved with your state, wherever you are in terms of jurisdictional responsibilities. And you will find out very quickly that it's more than just the model, or it's more than just the data. It's more than just doing the product so that at the end of the month you've produced something that can go into a model, for example. Oh, gee, added another variable to the model. So what? So what does it all mean? Again, I'll be giving anecdotes through my career throughout this, but I remember, again, when I was in Boston many years ago, I was working fairly high level. I was director of transportation planning for the state. And I remember looking at a young transportation planner, this kind of out of school, and he was so frustrated. And I said, what's the problem? He said, well, I've been working for 6 to 8 months now on this issue, this problem that was really important. And it went up to the mayor's office, and he said, no, we're not going to do that. And that was it. And he said, what am I doing? And I said, well, look, I said, this is the way you should look at it. Your job as a planner or an engineer is to produce the information that decision makers need or want in order to make decisions, let them make an informed decision. I said, what they do with it, it's up to them. If they ignore it and then something goes wrong, well, you can say, I did my best. So I don't look at the success of your professional career from the perspective of, did they implement what I wanted? But look at it from the perspective is, did I give them the information that was sufficient for them to make an informed decision? And my experience, by the way, is if they didn't buy it the first time, 3, 4, 5, 6 years later, they come back and there you are. You've done some of the preliminary analysis. So I would say, certainly be involved with your community. You learn the broader perspectives of what a planner means. You do have to have some base skills in order to do that as well, to make you valuable to your agency or organization. And the other thing I would say, and I've often told my students this, is that if you can speak in public, you are worth your weight in gold. When I was in government, I hired, I think, 400 new transportation engineers for the state DOT. The secretary turned to me and said, you're in charge of hiring all these people. And the true nuggets of the people that we hired were people that I would trust going out to a public meeting and not create a riot. They would go out and they would talk. They would say, yes, that's a very good idea. They're very sensitive to the issue of what people, if people, I kept telling them, if people bother to show up at a meeting, then you listen to what they have to say. You may not agree with it, but don't say that. Just say, gee, that's useful information, and we'll look at that. You have to treat them with respect. So communication skills, and I know not everybody can do that. Some people are scared to get up in front of a group, but if you can somehow feel comfortable speaking to people in a way that explains perhaps somewhat complex issues in fairly simple terms that they can understand how that affects them, that is really very worthwhile. And then also broadens your perspective. The example I've given, then I'll quit. As you can tell, I talk a lot. I for 5 years, I was director of transportation planning and development for Massachusetts at the state level. I've been a professor before that. And I can speak in public. And so the governor and the secretary would always send me out to face the crowd, okay? Because I would not create a riot by what I would say. And I would say 90% of the time, people would say, well, the reason we don't like what you're doing is because it's destroying our quality of life. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? Well, I don't know, but I know you're destroying it. I said, but I have to go back and advise the governor and the secretary, and I just can't go back and say you're destroying their quality of life. I mean, is it housing? Is it access to public health? Is it education? Is it access to jobs? What do you mean? Well, I don't know, but by God, and so you hear that a lot, and that sensitized me in many ways then to become, well, that's something that's very important. You have to understand what that means and why that's important. And automatically that then broadens your perspective just beyond that intersection or that transit facility or that bike path or whatever the case is. It's a long-winded answer to your question, but it's as I said, it really all depends in terms of what your context is.
Absolutely. One of the things I do in my spare time with my chapter, the Illinois chapter of the APA, is I volunteer as a plane commission trainer. And the piece you just mentioned there about speaking in public and being able to not incite a riot is it comes up in those trainings a lot. It's like,
absolutely,
hey,
yeah,
if someone's really angry at me, how do I de-escalate that? And the power of the words, thank you for your comment, is so powerful to just acknowledge and thank.
As the director of planning, the secretary asked me to go out and chair this task force on a project that had been delayed for like 20 years because nobody could agree on anything. It was a 60-person advisory committee, primarily of local citizens and stuff, and that no one could agree on anything. And I'm someone who will go out and try to get some consensus. Not everybody may agree, but at least treat them politely and with respect. And anyway, to make a long story short, is at the end of the process, there was one person who had led the charge, about a 70-year-old guy. He was so proud of the fact that he had stopped this project, and we took a vote, and the vote was 59-1. In favor of what the state wanted to do. And he came up to me afterwards. He says, you are the most dangerous person in Massachusetts. And I said, well, why do you say that? He says, because you could tell someone something and you could be stabbing them in their back, but they would love it because of the way you treat them. And I said, well, I don't necessarily agree with the analogy. I said, but if you treat people with respect and say, look, that's a good idea, we'll get back to you. And I don't think we can do that for the following reasons, but it's a good idea. You get people to realize that their input is valuable. And so that's almost an art form than anything else in terms of how you treat with people. It's the bottom line.
It's not quite as graphically, but I definitely remember getting feedback in grad school that I had the ability to have people think my ideas were their own, which was the best.
Oh, that's absolutely. That's also that's a good way of putting it as well. Yeah.
But so I kind of want to stay in this realm of like the public meeting or the hearing on an issue, because I think back to positions I've had before that maybe weren't as specialized as the position I'm in now, and I was just that kind of frontline, do it all, wear every hat, small municipality planner. And oftentimes people in those positions, and I know that I'm sure a lot of those kind of folks listen to this podcast, end up having to speak on things that maybe isn't within their area of expertise. They have to provide that comment on a traffic plan, on pedestrian connectivity, and that just might not be their specialism. So what advice, or if we were to drop this 1,200-page book onto the desk of that municipal planner who maybe doesn't have time to learn everything about transportation planning, what do they need to know to effectively communicate these issues in that public meeting sphere?
Well, I would say, not everybody can be an expert on everything, obviously. And so I would say what they need to know is certainly the process. And that's chapter 1. I mean, it's very important to understand how all the pieces fit together. I would say also, even if you know you're going to comment on a ped bike plan, or if you know you're going to comment on a freight plan, at least understand some of the basics. I mean, don't go up in front of a conversation of a freight plan and say, well, pedestrian and bicycle. No, that's, there may be some bicycles used for freight delivery, goods delivery, but you need to know a little bit of the basics. So I would say do your homework for maybe 30 to 45 minutes beforehand, so you know a little bit about it. And then, quite frankly, I'll be honest. Say that you're not an expert. Say, look, I'm not an expert on ped bike, or I'm not an expert on freight, or I'm not an expert on whatever. But here are things that I think you should consider because they relate to what I am responsible for or what I am doing. I've seen people try to portray, and I'm consulting a lot, so I've seen this in consulting in particular, pretending like they know everything, and you can see right through it. I mean, when I was in state DOT, I was, as I said, director of transportation planning development, but I had traffic engineering and operations reporting to me. So every time there was a site development approval on access to a state highway, they had to come to me. And I want to tell you, and I had been a professor at MIT for many years, so I understood a little bit about transportation. And so the folks would come to me with their consultants and the local officials, and they would say X, Y, and Z, and X, Y, and Z, and this is what I said. Answered these following questions, and they were shocked that I actually knew how to ask the right questions. And then I said, this is the reason why, for example, they said, well, we're going to have this major regional shopping mall on this 2-lane state highway. It's going to have no impact whatsoever because we did our traffic impact study on, at 8:00 on a Saturday morning. And I said, doesn't the mall open up at 10? Yes. Well, presumably there wouldn't be any traffic there at 8:00 in the morning, would there? I guess not. And so to me, knowing what the right questions to ask based on even a limited knowledge of what the subject is important. And ask. I mean, people sometimes hesitate to ask, but if you're in a bigger organization, I know that for a small city or municipality, may not have a lot of staff people, but for larger ones, you may actually have someone who knows a little bit about freight or knows about ped bike. Call them up and say, could you tell me a little bit about this issue. What do you think some of the key issues are? There's nothing wrong with getting advice from other people and then presenting that advice when you're in front of a group doing it. So I would say, be realistic, be pragmatic, do your homework and be honest. I don't know much about this subject. I'm not an expert on it. However, it seems to me that these are the key questions you need to address in this study or whatever the case you're doing.
I really like the story of the mall because I think that's such a thing that happens with like young planners is sometimes we feel like we are limited by our codes, or if we're reviewing something, we have to follow this checklist. And it's like, no, common sense can play a factor in your review, and you can think about things like, well, hey, doesn't this only open at 10 a.m.?
Well, and that particular meeting was interesting. It had a U.S. senator, 2 congressmen, the mayor, city councilors, leading manufacturers, and a lot of citizens in the room. And then there was me on the other side. And and I said all I was doing was asking what I consider to be reasonable questions, and the consultant his face was turning redder and redder when I kept asking the questions. And so they ended up doing a lot of mitigation that they weren't expecting because of obviously I was trying to protect the state highway. So yeah.
So you've spoken a couple of times of your experience in those bigger organizations, and I think that really helps with my next question. So, moving away from that smaller municipal planner who maybe doesn't have a support network and thinking about these bigger teams. So, for example, in the job I do now, I'm a transportation planner, and we also have a traffic transportation engineer. What's the delineation between those two roles? If this is a podcast mainly targeted towards planners, but I'm sure some engineers would listen. How can engineers and planners work together effectively? What are the roles that each one should be taking?
Well, here I go. It all depends.
It depends. Right?
Well, okay, and that's a very interesting question because I think the lines have blurred a lot. People, I mean, they need to understand the context. They're looking at the community. They're looking at the region. They're looking at the state. And so when you're designing a particular freeway or whatever the case is, as an engineer here, there may be system-wide effects down the line or upstream that you may not be thinking about because you're just designing between the two boundary points that the planners can, in fact, provide information and input on. And so to me, planners are broader thinkers. Yes, they can focus on specific issues, but they're broader thinkers in terms of looking at the bigger picture in terms of what an engineer might be looking at and doing. That also means the issues. And so that the engineer, and again, some of my best friends are engineers. I'm an engineer and they're very good engineers. But some of the engineers say, well, another example is that I led the charge at the Transportation Research Board many years ago, which is a group of the National Academy of Sciences. They said we transportation people need to look at climate change and the impact that transportation has on climate change, and vice versa, the impact of climate change on transportation. I presented that to the policy committee of this major board. And all the DOT people said, "Oh, go away! We're getting blamed for health. We're getting blamed for air quality. We're not going to get blamed for climate change. No, we're not going to do that." It ended up, I figured out a way to do it, so we did it. But engineers tend to focus on specific issues. The job, we are going to design this transit line from X to Y. We're going to design this transit facility or this freeway from X to Y. Yes, that has to be done within an environmental impact statement often, or it has to be done within existing state or federal rules if it's a bigger picture. And yes, we've got to do that. But generally, they don't see the bigger picture. And engineers are very good at putting together a design of a facility or an asset or even a larger network that will survive, that will last, and will operate supposedly according to the performance criteria. The planners look at the big puzzle. The engineers love to put the little puzzle pieces in, and they have to be together. I mean, if you're putting the little puzzle piece in, you've got to figure out how that piece fits with the other pieces. Otherwise, you can't put that piece in. And I had planners and engineers in my classes all the time, transportation planning and policy classes. I forced them to work together. A student group doing an assignment could never have only engineers and only planners. Now, I want to tell you, there was a lot of frustration. I had the planners coming to me and say, all they want to do is numbers. And I had the engineers come to me and say, they don't understand numbers. And so I said, look, this is the real world. You've got to work together, work it out, figure it out. So I understand there's a different mindset. There's often a different educational training, professional development background. There's a different mindset often in engineering organizations versus a planning organization. But what I have found is that, when you work together on projects and realize that each has their own contribution to make, then I think that things work out. The only other thing I would say, that when I was in Massachusetts DOT, the secretary came to me and said, I want this project that was lasting forever. Here's what he had a tendency to go out and draw on the back of a napkin what he wanted to have done, and then hand it to the engineer and say, do this. Well, he did it to me. And I went to my engineer and said, here, he says, don't tell me the secretary drew on the napkin. I guess, yes, he did. So he looked at it. 2 minutes later, he came into my office. If you've heard of the Green Book, the Astor Green Book, which is like the design manual, he slammed it on my desk and said, this is why we can't do it. And he left my office and went back to his office. I waited 2 minutes. I took up the book and I went back to his office and I slammed it on his desk. And I said, I read it, do it. He said, there's no way in the world that you could have done that. I said, well, that's because I read it before. I taught it. So I said, and all you have to do is look at the very first page of the design manual. It says, these should not be construed as set in concrete design standards. You use your engineering judgment and be as flexible and adaptive as possible, given the context of within which you are designing. I said, there it is. There it is. It doesn't say you have to have so many lanes and so many feet wide. So use your judgment. And yes, we have to justify it clearly for safety and liability reasons. I said, but try to figure out a design that really sets within that case the environmental context. And we were able to do that. So I think, my ideal person is take a planner, superimpose upon that person an engineer or vice versa, and you've got what you have as a good transportation professional. That's the term I usually use, a transportation professional, not a planner or an engineer, because professionals are much broader than just simply a focus on a particular discipline.
It's interesting because it seems like every planning conference over the last couple of years always has one session on how do planners and engineers work together. You talk for an hour and a half trying to figure this out.
A lot of it has to do with terminology. A lot of it has to do with the background. I've worked a lot, with engineers and planners. I'm the bridge between the two, and I can see, where there could potentially be hot spots in that interaction. But I think the younger generation, by the way, I've been around almost a little bit more than 4 decades, so I've seen how the generations have changed as they go through universities and professional. And I think the younger generation is much more amenable and I think if given the opportunity, much more amenable to be able to work in with other people in a collaborative way versus those who say, here's the design guide, this is what we've got to do, end of story. So I hold out great hope for the next generation in transportation planning.
I will say I had an anecdote from transportation plan, a friend of mine who's vice president at a consulting firm, and he was talking about how he fell into transportation planning during the 2010 economic downturn. because he just needed a job. And he went into that job very soft skill planner based. And he just learned the transportation, and he took advantage of the engineers around him, and he sat and he learned. And I'm trying to follow that model myself right now. Our transportation traffic engineer is fantastic, and I will just sit with him for an hour and watch him work, and I will leave with a headache every time, but I will try, right?
Well, I'm a strong believer. I did myself, and when I was the state DOT, but all the studies I've done about how do you provide professional capacity, mentoring, I think, is an incredible strategy. You tie yourself to your traffic engineer, you tie yourself to someone who's been around for a long time. And I established formal mentoring programs in my agencies, and the younger people would come to me and say, "Oh my God, I've learned so much." Often not necessarily what's in the design guidebook, but how do you get things done? And so I think mentoring, which is basically what you just mentioned, is an incredibly important strategy for getting younger transportation planners aware of what the world is really like and how they can, in my opinion, how they can affect that world. So
let's stay on that idea of what the world is really like, because obviously active transportation, bike ped, multimodal, these are all buzzwords that, to Stephanie's point from before, probably appear at every single planning conference at least once, because it's the kind of thing that everybody wants to do. And I think I try my best in my volunteering to work with students wherever possible, because I know I needed someone to do that for me when I was a student. And there's a lot of bent towards advocacy, which is not a bad thing. But if there was someone coming up who is seeing these ideas and really wants to go to bat and advocate for increased active transportation options, let's say they're a professional, they're working, how do they begin to have those conversations, especially in those communities that typically have not had those conversations before? You said it before about providing that information, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's another good question. I mean, as director of planning, I literally had a bike ped advocate in my office every week for 5 years. I mean, yelling and screaming, "Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that?" They inundated public meetings. So, we're supposed to report on what did the public say at our public meetings. Well, 95% of the people wanted more bicycle paths. And so, I understand advocacy. I understand the importance of certain modes of transportation in the bigger picture. I would say that, to me, and I guess another example is I have spoken a lot in my career about multimodal statewide plans, transportation plans. And so I wrote some papers several years ago and participated with some AASHTO conferences about how it's important to have a multimodal transportation plan. Well, Minnesota, which I consider to be one of the best states in the country in terms of the DOT, I was all excited because they said, "Well, we want to show you our statewide plan." So I went to them and said, "Well, here's our statewide multimodal transportation plan," which was a bunch of policies and stuff. And said, "Well, here's our rail plan, here's our ped bike plan, here's our public transit plan." I said, "What are you doing? Those are modal plans, yes, but it's done within the bigger picture of the context of the system-wide plan." And that's when I learned, and I was young at the time, and that's when I learned that, in fact, yes, it's important to focus on elements of the broader system. And I think, ped bike people, largely because of them, we now have the active transportation emphasis that we see in several federal programs and state programs. And I think they've done a great job. Sometimes, though, they take it to the absence of, well, everybody has to get out of the car and get on a bike. Well, that ain't going to happen. Okay. Just not in my lifetime. So I think you have to be realistic about it. But my sense is, for folks who really want to emphasize or focus on a particular, what I would call mode of transportation, understand the bigger picture first. Understand, for example, where would a bike or a bike path or a pedestrian facility connect to major activity centers? Where would it connect to maybe transit facilities, transit stations, that type of thing? And make the argument that really that connectivity for people who aren't driving or taking transit is an important part of the overall system. Justify it in a way of simply saying, we need connectivity, we need to have accessibility, not just simply, well, we want to see more bikes out there. That's not going to fly in most cases. Okay. So I do think this issue of looking at the broader multimodal system and where what you're interested in fits into it is important. Second of all, I do think, going back to this idea of transportation enables other things, it was called ped bike for a long time, and now it's active transportation. Why is it called active transportation? Because of public health and obesity issues, active, exercise and that type of stuff. So look to expand the justification or rationale for what it is you want to do beyond just simply, we want more bikes out there. If you say, well, we want to get more people physically active so that we can affect the public health, or we want to provide safe movement for our children who want to either walk or take a bike, safety issues. And so broadening the perspective on these things to beyond just simply what you're focused on, I think, and I've seen this be very successful, where things that were argued one way didn't go at all. And then when it was broadened to say, but look at how this helps economic development, look how this helps public health, suddenly the decision maker said, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And so that's another important, I think, ingredient of a successful strategy for those who are focusing on, specifically what you're interested in. Now, that's not to say, remember I said before, it's important to have a good analysis tool or methodology or capability. I mean, someone who's interested in ped bike or public transport or whatever the case is, I mean, being good at that, being able to analyze the data, come up with reasonable, that lends to your credibility. I would recommend to someone who's interested in ped bike in their initial stages of their career, make sure you know what the current level of service methodology is for ped bike, which has changed dramatically over the last 10 years. Make sure you understand how that relates to other public policy issues other than just transportation. And understand how, from a methodological or tool perspective, you can actually do that, because that makes you very valuable. An example I would use outside of that is freight. Freight was nothing when I was young. I mean, freight that was a private sector issue. No way would a public sector agency deal with anything with freight. That just wasn't their responsibility. Well, in the 1990s, in the Intermodal Surface Transportation Act, where intermodal said, oh my God, that means freight. Suddenly freight became an important issue. I've done a lot of work in freight. And now there are MPOs that actually have freight planners or freight professional staff that know what the freight models are. They know what the freight data is. They know who the freight stakeholders are in their region. They understand the bigger marketplace issues with regard to supply chains. And so that's an example of how people, the agencies have changed, the environment has changed. And so too have the necessary skills and capabilities of people that you want in those roles and responsibilities. So, if you're interested in, let's be absurd, flying saucers is a mode of transportation. Okay, well, better understand what the basics are for flying saucers. So if they ever get into that, then maybe you can want to do it, which I'm being facetious, but understand, in fact, what it is that you can contribute to those discussions in an analytical and in a descriptive way that makes yourself valuable and useful to the types of decisions that have to be made.
I, for one, am very interested in flying saucers as a mode of transportation.
Well, you look like someone who would be, by the way. So
I will be putting regulations for tractor beams in my next zoning code update. I can tell you.
There you
that
go.
much.
Well, you have the drones coming up. The autonomous drones dropping off goods in front of your door. So there we go.
Well, and let's talk about that as probably my final question of this interview, because this has been great just hearing these stories. We touched on at the very beginning that this fourth edition really blossomed into a 2.5-year project from an update from the third edition. And I think we can all safely say that a lot has changed over the past couple of years, I'm thinking.
Yeah.
These drones, a lot of emphasis on curbside businesses, a lot of changes to freight, the increase in the potential of autonomous vehicles, and then from what I'm reading, potentially now that's going away again because there's a lot of concern over that. But where do you begin to think about a fifth edition? I'm not asking you to give away the first chapter for free live on air, but what's next?
I mean, that's a good question. I've actually, my whole life, I keep thinking about what is it that's happening that we need to think about in transportation. And in chapter 1 of the fourth edition, you'll see there's a figure that I developed saying, here are the things that are happening differently within the context of transportation that becomes important. I will start with technology. This has been 6 years since the last edition. One of the things that clearly has changed dramatically is the technology of transportation, whether that's autonomous, connected vehicles, electric vehicles. In fact, you're going to see a lot more electric vehicles, and you'll see connect autonomous, at least in the short term, which, by the way, has incredible impacts on revenues. I mean, we still haven't figured out how we're going to pay for roads and infrastructure that electric vehicles still need, but they're not paying gas taxes. So, how is that going to happen? So I think the whole idea of what has happened in the interim in terms of advances in technology on the transportation system, what are some of the foreseeable technologies that in fact could happen? Well, I love science fiction. I remember reading one when I was 12 years old going, this is fascinating. And I've read ever since. And what happens in me is science fiction authors are often 10 years ahead of everybody else because they're familiar with, I'm not about Asimov and satellites, but But if you read science fiction, they started talking about 3D printing about 10 years ago. Okay. And I thought, well, what in God's name is 3D printing? Well, then I go, well, now we have 3D printing. And think about 3D printing. What does 3D printing replace? It replaces freight movement. Okay. So instead of moving chairs and tables and other things long distances from where they're manufactured in North Carolina to wherever they're going, you just put the plan and send it electronically to a place in Atlanta where I am, and it manufactured it. And I've seen 3D manufactured houses now. And so I think that 3D printing technology is going to revolutionize trucking, at least long distance trucking for certain types of commodities. And so I would certainly start with technology. And I'm not one who claims I know everything about technology, but if I read science fiction, I'll probably get close to it. And then there's also the technology of what I said before, kind of the personal technology, the apps. What we can do now that, years ago we weren't able to do. And I have a handheld phone. Believe me, when I grew up, in fact, my kids said, well, how did you communicate back then? I said, well, if you were in the car, you had to stop and go to this thing called a telephone booth. You had to put coins in a machine and you had this little rotary thing. Well, what is that? So now you got this wonderful, almost computer in your hand here that can do a lot of things that revolutionizes how we view transportation as well. Second, Uber, Lyft, all the network type of things, again, when they came out, people were saying, well, this is wonderful. First thing I thought of was, oh my God, that's going to impact transit. And I think it has. And so all those innovations that are now coming about and have come about on the personal side. I spent, I think, 2 months out of the country a year or so ago prior to COVID. And I came back and suddenly there was these scooters everywhere. I mean, in 2 months, these scooters were introduced. I said, what are these things? I'd never heard of them before. It's just like that. There was a new innovation. And so those innovative, creative mobility options, I think, are also going to be important. I mentioned COVID. Okay. My kids think I'm strange because I think in transportation terms on everything. So COVID hits. And what was the first two things I thought of? Well, 6 foot spacing, that means all the designs we've done for transit platforms and loading platforms for elevators now are not good enough because you can't, we used to do crushed load, 2 feet apart. Well, my God, we're going to have to change our whole design concept. My kids are going, people are dying from COVID and you're thinking about elevators. What's wrong with you? And then the other thing, of course, is the impact of COVID on workplace. As you've heard, a lot of people don't want to go back to work and aren't going to go back to work, especially the younger generation. Well, much of our transportation planning focuses on the commute trip. And so I argued at the very beginning of COVID, and I think we're starting to see it, that COVID has fundamentally rethought how we as a society view how we get together with people. And hopefully, there aren't long-lasting effects in terms of health effects with this, but I think COVID and that disruption to our normal life is going to have a huge impact on transportation. I also think that, with regard to transit in particular, again, one of my first implications of COVID was, oh my gosh, that's going to hurt transit. And it did. We have to rethink transit. Clearly in certain corridors in urban areas where there's density, I think, line haul types of facilities might make some sense. I was responsible for a redesign of the transit system in Atlanta a couple of years ago. And what we did there was to say, look, it's not so much a network per se as look at target markets. What are the markets you're trying to serve and how do you link those markets to the types of characteristics of services you want? So it could be a small shuttle bus rather than a big, huge bus going up and down, 10% empty or 10% full. And so the targeting to the markets of what you're really trying to serve, I think is important. And then, rethinking what does it mean to be a transit agency. I said 30 years ago, there was in fact a movement afoot that didn't last very long, that transit agencies should be mobility managers, not transit providers. Mobility, which could be, services such as Uber, Lyft. Of course, that's been taken away now, superseded by them. Services to the elderly, handicapped, and others who didn't have it, which they did. Yeah, yes, transit services, but it could also be telecommunications and all sorts of stuff. Smart cards that you can use for transit as well as for buying things, which we now have. So I think rethinking what we mean by transit is a very important policy question that a lot of urban areas really need to think through very carefully, especially in the context of COVID and the new technologies that are coming online. And then finally, in terms of where would I start, I hate to say this to everybody, but as we sit here, we are all getting older, and me more than you. And so we are an aging society. The whole social demographic characteristics of our population is changing. Where people live is different than where people lived many years ago. how we go to school is different than what we did many years ago. Who's going to school? The whole social demographic mantra of our nation is changing dramatically. I think it's the 2050 census, I believe, or 2040 census, where they say we will for the first time in history be a non-majority white nation. I mean, that has huge implications in terms of how we as transportation communicate, deal, what types of services you want. So ordinarily, in traditional terms, I would say I would start with social demographic change. But I think where we are as a society, I would start with technology. I think that really is going to have a big and short-term impact. And then I would go to the social demographic side and understand what the new generation is thinking of in terms of what's important and valuable to them. And just a case in point, I've done a lot of work in climate change over the last 12 years. I've had a hard time convincing my generation that this is really important. I don't have to spend very much time convincing the new generation it's important. They're on board. They're for it. They understand it. And it's going to take time for the transition to them to get into power, I think, to do anything significant, which unfortunately may be too late. But that's another example of a policy issue that I think is of great concern to the younger people, more so than it's been to my generation.
Well, this has been a really good conversation. And my final wrap-up question might be a little bit challenging, knowing that the book is quite large and very thorough, and we've only had our short episode to talk about it. But what have we not talked about that you think our listeners should know, or what's kind of the one important takeaway that you would want to relay to listeners?
Well, I think, in fact, I jotted down some things which I've already talked about, so I can't say we haven't talked about them. The COVID I wanted to bring in, I wanted to talk about social demographics. I guess the one final thing I would say, which I've said and hinted at throughout my talk, is that planning does not occur in a static world. Planning and engineering occurs in a dynamic world, and we have to adapt. That's all there is to it. And so by definition, that means planning has to consider what are those changes that are going to be relevant to society that we need to put in place stuff now to help foster that or to help mitigate some of the impacts, whatever the case may be. I kept saying that transportation enables fill in the blank. I still think that's a very important point of departure, that if you're looking at transportation, it's not just an intersection, it's not just a bus, it's not just a ped bike facility. It enables other things. So therefore, how do you connect transportation to allow the government or the public sector, private sector, communities, whatever the case may be, to allow them to achieve goals and objectives that are beyond just simply transportation goals? And that to me is the most important lesson. And that's, by the way, throughout that entire book is that issue. So for example, in most of every chapter, I talk about performance measures. I mean, one of the things that we've seen in the last 10 years or so in transportation is the requirement to put in performance measures of system performance to say, how is that changing over time? Well, what I did in that book is for the highways, for the transit, for the ped bike, for everything, I said, here are, by the way, some typical performance measures you may want to use to monitor what's happening. And that's, in planning, that's the feedback loop. That's as I told my students, planning is a job for life, because every 4 or 5 years you want to update the plan, and we live in a dynamic world. So things change. So you're always going to have a job for life. And so those performance measures is something in this book you won't find anywhere else, where in fact for specific modes, here are the things that you can measure. And that's just an indication of this dynamic context within which transportation planning occurs. And as I've told my students, don't get too upset, because tomorrow is going to bring you another challenge that you hadn't even thought of. And you'll get excited and motivated to deal with it. And don't get depressed because they didn't do X, Y, and Z, because tomorrow something's going to come along and you'll be able to have strong influence in terms of what we should be doing. So I think it's a great field to be in. It's one that has never a dull moment, at least in certain areas. Highly, highly relevant to society, to communities, to your friends and what they do or don't do in terms of work, live, and play. And it's one that I think is constantly being upgraded in terms of new tools, new data, new issues, new people into the profession. So yeah, it's an exciting field, and I think it will continue to be as we go forward.
I think that's a great way to wrap up, and I really appreciated all the anecdotes and the conversation today. So,
I've got a lot more stories, I assure you.